Nobody warns you about this part. They warn you about the gray hair, the slower mornings, the reading glasses you swore you would never need. They warn you about the knees, the back, the way recovery from anything takes longer than it used to. But nobody warns you about the morning you wake up, look in the mirror, and realize you do not fully recognize the person looking back. Not physically, something deeper than that. You look at your own reflection, and somewhere behind your eyes there is a quiet, unsettling question forming. One you have never had to ask before. One that younger people assume only teenagers ask. Who am I now? If you are over 50 and you have felt this even quietly, even only in the hours before the rest of the house wakes up, I want you to know something before anything else. You are not losing your mind. You are not broken. You are not alone in this feeling, even though it can feel profoundly, isolatingly alone. What you are experiencing has a name. Psychologists call it an identity shift, and research tracking adults across decades of their lives shows that the majority of people over 50 go through exactly this, a gradual, quiet unraveling of the self they spent decades constructing. Not a crisis in the dramatic sense, not a breakdown, just a growing sense that the person they have been performing for 40 years does not quite fit anymore, and not knowing yet who fits instead. Here is how it usually begins, not with a dramatic event, not with a single moment of clarity. It begins in small things. You are in a conversation, and you notice you are saying what is expected of you rather than what you actually think. You are at a family gathering, and you find yourself playing a role so familiar that you could perform it in your sleep. And somewhere underneath the performance, a part of you is watching from a distance, quietly wondering, is this me, or is this just the version of me that everyone needed me to be? For most people over 50, the identity they built, the one that felt so solid, so real, so permanent, was constructed almost entirely around roles. The provider, the parent, the responsible one, the strong one, the one who held everything together, the one who never complained, the one who showed up every single time, regardless of what it cost internally. Those roles were real. The effort behind them was real. The love behind them was real. But roles are not the whole self. And somewhere in the 50s, the gap between the role you play and something deeper inside you begins to widen in ways that can no longer be ignored. And then the roles start to change. The children leave. The career ends or shifts. The marriage changes shape after decades. A parent dies, and suddenly you are the oldest generation now, the one at the front of the line. And that realization alone can shake something loose in a person that nothing else quite reaches. And when the roles that answered the question, who am I, begin to dissolve, the question itself returns, louder than before, more urgent, more uncomfortable, because for 40 years you did not need to answer it. The roles answered it for you. You were a father, a mother, a professional, a husband, a wife, a provider, a caretaker. The answer was always right there, built into the structure of the day, confirmed by the people around you who needed you to be exactly who you were. And now the structure has changed, and the question has no easy answer anymore. That is not failure. That is not weakness. That is simply what happens when a life reaches a stage where the scaffolding that held the identity in place begins to come down, and what is underneath has not yet been fully seen. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Most of what you have believed about yourself for the last several decades was not chosen. Not really. It was constructed, piece by piece, from what your family needed you to be, from what your work required you to be, from what your community expected you to be, from the accumulated weight of other people's needs pressing against you, year after year, slowly shaping you the way water shapes stone, not through cruelty, not through anyone's bad intention, simply through the ordinary, relentless pressure of a lived life. And here is the part that takes the longest to absorb: that constructed version of yourself was not fake. It was real. It served a purpose. It got children raised and bills paid and crises navigated and people loved and decades survived. You can appreciate that version of yourself without needing to be that version forever. But you are allowed to ask, now that the pressure has shifted, now that the roles have changed, now that the decades of performing have slowed enough for silence to enter, who am I when nobody is watching? Who am I when nobody needs anything from me? Who am I when the day is empty and the house is quiet and there is no role to perform and no function to fulfill? That question is not a symptom of something wrong with you. That question is the beginning of something important. The research is actually quite clear on this, and I find it strangely comforting, so I want to share it with you directly. A longitudinal study tracking adults from their late 20s all the way through to their 50s found that the vast majority of people go through a fundamental redefinition of their sense of self during this period. Not a crisis, a redefinition. A natural, if uncomfortable, developmental process that the human being was always meant to go through. The problem is, nobody told us this was coming. Nobody sat us down at 45 and said, listen, in about a decade, the version of yourself you built for everyone else is going to start feeling too small. The roles are going to shift. The questions are going to return. And that is not something going wrong. That is something finally going right. Instead, most people experience the shift in complete silence. They do not talk about it because there is no language for it in their social circles. Their friends are busy performing their own roles. Their family assumes they are fine because they have always been fine. And so the quiet unraveling happens in private Dara in the early hours of the morning, in the space between sleeping and waking, in the car alone on the way to somewhere that no longer feels entirely meaningful. That silence is one of the loneliest parts of the whole experience. Not because you are actually alone, but because you feel unspeakable. Like what you are going through does not have a name that people around you would understand. It has a name, and you are not the only one going through it. So what actually helps? And I want to be honest here, not offer easy answers that sound reassuring, but do not reach the actual wound. Because this is not a problem that gets solved by taking up a hobby, or buying something new, or keeping busier than before. Those things can help temporarily. They do not reach the root. What actually helps is curiosity, not pressure, not urgency, not the demand that you figure out who you are by next Tuesday, but genuine, patient, open curiosity about the person who has been underneath the roles all along. Because here is what the research also tells us. The self that exists beneath the constructed identity, beneath the decades of roles and performances and other people's needs, that self did not disappear. It was simply waiting, quietly, patiently, in the way that certain things wait underground through long winters before the conditions are right for them to emerge. You have interests that were set aside decades ago because there was no time. You have opinions you learned to soften because they created friction. You have a way of seeing the world that got buried under the weight of being useful to everyone else. Those things are still there. And this stage of life, as disorienting as it feels from inside it, is actually the first extended opportunity many people have had in decades to go looking for them. The second thing that helps is giving yourself permission to not know yet. Most people over 50 were raised in a generation that valued certainty, that treated not knowing as weakness, that expected a person to have answers about their life, their purpose, their identity, and to maintain those answers consistently across decades without wavering. But identity was never meant to be a fixed thing. Even the psychologists who study it most closely describe it as a dynamic, evolving construct, something that is always in process, always responding to experience, always capable of being revised. You are not supposed to have this figured out permanently by now. Nobody does. The people who seem most certain of who they are after 50 are often simply the ones who stopped asking the question. And there is a difference between settling into yourself and simply going quiet on the question because it became too uncomfortable to sit with. You are asking the question. That is not weakness. That is one of the bravest things a person can do at any age. And the third thing, the one that perhaps matters most of all, is understanding that becoming a stranger to yourself after 50 is not the end of knowing yourself. It is the beginning of knowing yourself more honestly than you ever have before. Because the self you are meeting now, the one emerging in the quiet, in the uncertainty, in the uncomfortable spaces between the old roles and whatever comes next, that self is not performing for anyone. It is not shaped by what the family needed, or what the career required, or what the community expected. It is simply you, perhaps for the first time in a very long time. And yes, that can feel frightening. Unfamiliar things usually do, but frightening and wrong are not the same thing. And unfamiliar and bad are not the same thing either. Sometimes the most important meeting of a person's life is the one they have with themselves. After the noise finally settles, after the roles finally shift, after the decades of being everything for everyone else finally leave enough space for the question to return. Who am I now? That question is not a problem to be solved quickly. It is an invitation to look more carefully, to listen more honestly, to allow the person who has been carrying everything for everyone else for 40 years to finally, quietly, without apology, begin the process of coming home to themselves. You are not lost. You are between versions of yourself, and that Durara is not the same thing at all.